Hello and welcome to Domicile Corporate Services podcast series Advancing Vietnam with me, Vlad Savin and Matthew Lowry. Throughout the following episodes, we will look into answering relevant questions about doing business in Vietnam. What are the opportunities and challenges faced by investors entering the market or existing players in major industries? We will seek to understand the business environment from a cultural local mindset and how to deal with compliance from an international perspective. What are the major risks faced by businesses active in the region and how to overcome them? And last but not least, we will dive deep into the compliance environment in Vietnam, discussing processes and procedures, changes in laws, latest official updates from the authorities, and financial governance planning for businesses active in Vietnam. We at Domicile Corporate Services consider compliance a major asset for foreign investors operating in Vietnam. We emphasize this aspect when speaking with our clients and make sure they understand the significant benefits of being compliant. In this episode, I'm discussing with Matthew Lowry, managing partner at Domicile Corporate Services, about the role, responsibilities, and functions of one of the most important statutory positions in a Vietnamese corporation from a compliance perspective, the chief accountant. Matthew, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Vlad. It's terrific to be here and start our podcast series with such an important and often misunderstood topic.
Indeed. Matthew, chief accountant is a critical function in Vietnam with major responsibilities and risks attached. However, not many know exactly what is a chief accountant and what is its role in Vietnam. Can you explain?
A chief accountant is a concept that's not always understood. It's doesn't always have a comparable version in other countries. So the easiest way to explain it is part of the company secretarial function. It is part of the tax compliance function, and it has an oversight and control of the accounting or the statutory accounting function. So all companies have to appoint a chief accountant. All companies must have one. It's important also for banking laws. And it's important as part of initial registrations to have a chief accountant. The chief accountant does have quite a senior role or an important role in organisations. So therefore, having one who understands the law, who meets the requirements of the law, is very important. And it is that statutory obligation that all companies have.
I see. And you mentioned before about the company secretarial function. How is the chief accountant different than the company secretarial, which is highly common in other jurisdictions across the globe?
Yeah, so there isn't a company secretary role in Vietnam. There is the legal representative that operates the company, or a number of legal representatives. There is the general director who runs the company practically, and then there is the chief accountant position. So they're the sort of ongoing statutory positions. Because there is no company secretary, the compliance function effectively vests in the chief accountant. They are the party that the authorities will contact. They're the parties that liaises with the authorities, and as a result, it quasi fills that what we would take as this company secretarial role in a common law or Western style structure of a company. The legal representative does have certain obligations, but those obligations are often fulfilled or looked after by the chief accountant because there is no company secretarial role. So the protection that the director's legal rep normally would want from a secretarial comes from that chief accountant.
I understand. And why do you think the chief accountant is important? In your opinion, why should companies care whom they appoint in this function?
As I mentioned, they have a very broad role. From incorporating and starting a company, they have to be appointed, but knowing what needs to be lodged, what's the time frame, what the obligations are of a company, and understanding, because the tax obligations, the accounting obligations, which are linked, tax and accounting is intrinsically linked in Vietnam, really comes from the chief accountant. It comes from their understanding and their interpretation, meeting deadlines for governmental appointments, even controlling effectively the digital signature of the company sits with the chief accountant. If they don't have the experience, if they don't have the understanding, then the risk is that you are not going to be compliant, or that you're making decisions that's going to come back to bite you. And just as an aside, one of the tax considerations in Vietnam is there is effectively a 10-year look back for tax inspections, for late lodgements. They'll penalise you back to the very start. They'll go back and work out late lodgements, non-lodgements, non-compliance, errors. And that 10-year statute is used extensively when tax authorities are going back through a company. They do take advantage of that. You don't want opportunities to exist because the accountant didn't understand the rules or the laws. You really want someone who does understand, gives you the right advice, and protects the company from those future liabilities that might arise.
Thank you for the details, Matthew. And just to clarify, do all companies in Vietnam need a chief accountant? And how are they appointed? And what are the ongoing requirements for the chief accountants, if any?
Yeah, I see. So the law on accounting specifies that all companies must have a chief accountant, and the chief accountant is the head of the accounting function, the accounting regime in an organisation. That sounds very official. I'll explain in a moment what that actually means in practice, but the law does make it clear that it must appoint a chief accountant. Now, chief accountant primarily is someone who holds a chief accountant certificate, which is a certification, or is employed by an organisation which is licensed to provide outsourced chief accountant services, such as domicile corporate services. So there's those two options: employ your own or use an outsource agency. There is the third option for newly created companies or micro companies can, for the first 12 months, appoint a chief accountant who does not hold a certificate or be part of an outsourcing firm. However, and this is where we see people misinterpret it, the law makes it clear that person must have the same skills and experience as if they had a CA certificate, the same requirements. Therefore, it's very hard to meet those requirements unless they're a CA. So that is one of those points where people say, I don't need it for the first 12 months. Well, you still need someone who meets the qualifications effectively. But the upshot of that, and I mentioned before, is at the start, that's when it's most paramount to have someone who is experienced, because you must do all your registrations. And if you miss the deadlines, miss one, get it wrong, setting up your chart of accounts, setting up your compliance structure, that's when you can be presented with a significant level of risk. So it's often that even though you might have a gap at the start, that's when you don't want to have your gap. So the head of the accounting function is deemed, the chief accountant is deemed in law, but keep in mind that's a statutory accounting function. That is not necessarily all parts of your treasury and your planning and management reporting, etc. So I just want to put there that the chief accountant is head of the statutory accounting and tax, and it is an obligation within law to appoint them, and you have no choice. The last part of that is, as I said at the start, to open a bank account, the chief accountant is required to sign off on bank accounts. To do any tax adjustments or to do anything with the bank, with the tax registrations or lodgements, etc., requires the chief accountant. So they have an ongoing, almost invasive role in a business here, physical signatures, where they would not a similar role would not necessarily in another country.
We often hear certain companies don't appoint a chief accountant. What's that about, Matthew?
Yeah, you do hear this, and it does. You do hear this, and it does arise. That is correct, Vlad. The law is very clear about the appointment. We do know historically there are some banks and there are some companies just put a name down and just basically try to work around the laws. That's much, much harder. So without naming banks, there were some banks that were known to just do things without requiring it. We do know that certain tax branches were accepting forms. The thing now is that's pretty much a thing of the past. We've got the compliance regime in Vietnam, as it keeps developing, has closed those gaps. It's closed those opportunities. So you hear of it, but it is not something that I would encourage. It is not in line with the law. It is certainly a breach of the law, and that it does expose significant risk in how you operate, that if you can get penalised. Now, you can get penalised, just as an aside, not only for not appointing a chief accountant, you get penalised for appointing someone without the right qualifications, the same as you get appointed for not signing documents, and believe it or not, Vlad, for using a red pen. So there are an extensive amount of penalties and laws that exist, and this is one situation that would immediately expose you and be evidence and visible to the authorities on inspection.
And interesting, we both know that the chief accountant is required to sign when the company is established on the initial documentation. How do companies get around that without actually appointing a chief accountant, or who is that person that is actually signing there?
On the application itself?
Exactly.
Well, the application is more of an intent. It's until the company's established, that company can't appoint a chief accountant until it's established. So some people do get very worked up about that. I need a chief accountant to start my company. No, you need to, it's an intent. So that is not something that from a statutory perspective, which is covered by the law and accounting. The law and accounting is once the company is established, then you must appoint. So people I've seen quite worked up worrying about that. It's not the concern, it's an intent. So what goes on that part of the form is not a great concern, but as soon as the company is established, then you have an obligation.
Another question I get asked a lot is, why do I need a chief accountant? I can just get a tax agent. What is your experience with this matter, Matthew?
Okay, so that's the difference between different countries and different concepts. So the tax agent concept is not one applied here. The chief accountant represents the company in relation to taxation matters. They write to, they're registered with the tax authorities, they have responsibilities. So historically, many local Vietnamese companies would not outsource, would not engage external lawyers, accountants, tax agents, anything. It's all been internal role responsibility. And that's how the structure's put in place. So what you would normally have as a tax agent becomes someone who is providing as an outsourced or a outside review, an outside sign-off, an outside opinion, but the actual lodgement, the signing and lodgement of that is still signed by the chief accountant. The chief accountant has responsibility. So it's not that you can't use an outside technical party, it's just that the responsibilities resulting thereof still come back to the chief accountant. So where you come up with an issue with that is sometimes if you don't have a very competent chief accountant, or you have a chief accountant who is overconfident and you've got external parties giving you advice, external tax consultants giving you advice, and you have conflict. And that's often, or conflict, or you've got one party believing something different to the other party, you start having problems. So it's a matter of, if you are using a third-party tax consultant, they're not a tax agent of stuff. They're a consultant, they're an advisor working together with the internal chief accountant or the outsourced chief accountant if it's using an outsourced firm, and that together becomes your tax function. And that's this old idea about oversight, making sure you have the appropriate structure in place to provide oversight that works together.
Thank you, Matthew. And you mentioned just before about responsibility. So within a Vietnamese company, who in the end takes the ultimate responsibility within the accounting and compliance departments? Is it the chief accountant? Is it the legal rep or the general director? Or how is the responsibility divided?
It's both, where you've got the chief accountant takes responsibility. If they sign something incorrect or illegal, they will be responsible for it. However, if they put in writing saying that they object, they still must sign. If the legal representative requires them to sign, they must sign, but they can object. And if they object in writing, they can disclaim responsibility, and that ultimately at the head of the company, the legal representative will take responsibility for that, and they will have to take the risk. It's an interesting where breaches of law, anyone can be responsible. The ultimately legal representative is. The chief accountant can be and will be held responsible, but they can disclaim that responsibility within their role.
I see. And from this statutory perspective that you mentioned before, and you mentioned about the legal representative as well, what is the relation between the legal representative of a company in Vietnam and its chief accountant?
So as I mentioned before, the legal representative effectively holds the assets and the structure of the business. So you'll see in a Vietnamese contract a company represented by. So they give the civil capacity of a company is exercised through the legal representative. You can have more than one. Historically, we only allowed one. Now you can have more than one. And the legal representative is that represents the company. The chief accountant is signing off next to the legal rep in many things. So your monthly accounting records, your every accounting voucher that you need to produce for every single transaction you do, except electronic, but then you need a voucher for archiving. So everything you do needs signing, and it will monthly accounts, your taxes, your ongoing finance documentation will need to have the legal representing the company, the chief accountant representing the statutory obligations that being signed. So you'll constantly see the two parties signing everything in unison, one taking different responsibilities than the other, but they're both required. And that relationship is very important. So you often find for particularly Vietnamese, large Vietnamese companies, the chief accountant may actually have a board role, sitting next to the legal rep and the other directors. I wouldn't always encourage that, they're necessary, but that's the context they can be taken in Vietnam by some organizations.
Very interesting. Matthew, you've been in Vietnam for over 15 years now. That surely gives you a significant amount of practical experience. What are your observations on trust and risk from an international perspective regarding the role of the CA, the chief accountant?
Well, thanks for that. 15 years is a long time. It just tripped over the other day, so thank you. I thought just following on from my previous answer, so that risk of the chief accountant being deemed at the board level, I actually see that as working against particularly private international style companies where you often want an oversight. You offer CFO, the CFA may be responsible for treasury, for management reporting, and for statutory accounting and tax compliance. So the chief accountant, in my opinion, is one arm of that. It is not the most senior role. It's an important role, and that role enables it should have an oversight sitting above it, amongst it, that understands the laws, understands regulations. So where we don't have, and we often see small companies, I've got a chief accountant, they're fantastic. My chief accountant I trust. But unless someone's reviewing their work, unless there's an oversight, the ability to self-review isn't perceived as an issue quite often in Vietnam, where it's a major issue. That you can't see your own errors. You don't know the laws you don't know. And so that's a big risk that we see. So we always want to put a structure in place, whether that's an external review, as I said, the CFO reviewing the CA role, or combinations of having bookkeepers, accountants, CA reviewing them. There needs to be that process in place. So we also, where you see risks in an organisation like that, you actually and see structures in place that don't have that review. We do see sometimes, not often, theft. We do see misappropriation. We also see just very large compliance holes. We see periods where people come to us and say they're getting tax inspected and they can't find a year's worth of documents because they don't know where their previous accountant put it and there was no one else involved. So those risks are real, we see them, and they're major risks in Vietnam because the tax authorities, if they don't have supporting documents, can deem whatever they want and you can't prove them wrong. So there are significant exposures. So we also want to make sure that the chief accountant does understand the rules and the law, because a chief accountant, as I said right near the start of this podcast, that there's a certification. Once they've got the certificate, they can be a chief accountant forever. They've got 2 years practical experience, appropriate degree, and they sit for the certificate. And that by itself presents risks where they don't update themselves. They don't on top of knowledge. Law changes constantly in Vietnam. Interpretation of that law changes constantly. So if your chief accountant is simply just qualified and then doing their job and never updates, the company, again, is at risk. As laws change, they don't.
And they're not required to update their certification.
The funny thing is that as a licensed provider of outsourced chief accountant services, only our CPAs can sign. So a CPA requires 40 hours per year minimum of government-mandated training, let alone any internal training or professional training we do outside of that. And that's a requirement. So it's held to a higher standard. And we always encourage people to make sure that their chief accountant, if you use an outside chief accountant services, the CPA requirements do have a big impact. But even internally, making sure that there's a culture of self-education, training and development. And we see that medium and small companies, quite often there is this stagnant knowledge base, and that can expose people many years later, often when the chief accountant's left, that they were not applying the laws and that they weren't being kept abreast of the changes that are happening.
Matthew, thank you so much for your insights on this one. I think we're out of time for today, unfortunately.
My pleasure, Vlad. It's been great to talk.
Sure. Clearly, a chief accountant is a key role within organizations operating in Vietnam, and companies should take extra care to make sure the role is taken by someone with qualifications and expertise. Many thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in to Advancing Vietnam podcast series. For more information about this topic, please check out our publications on domicilecs.com. And if you want to reach out to us for any additional details, feel free to contact myself or Matthew on LinkedIn or through the website contact details.